All right, so today we're going to talk about risk analysis. What could possibly go wrong? Um, make sure my slides are moving. There we go. So I'm Ian Nicholson. I'm an engineer. I'm based in Calgary, Alberta. I've been working with risk analysis since the 90s, but I started working with Safran in 2017. Prior to that, I worked with PertMaster and Primavera Risk Analysis since about 2001. So I've seen a lot of risk analyses over the years. I've seen a lot of things go well, and I've seen a lot of things go poorly. So let's talk about some of the things you can do to make sure that your risk analysis goes well. So first of all, why do we conduct risk analysis? Well, we want our project teams and executives to understand and manage the risks on their projects. We want to get the project teams discussing the challenges of their project, and then we want them to be able to make informed decisions about cost and schedule on their project. Now, what we really want to do is we want to keep them focused on the right issues. There's a lot of issues that come up on a project, and what can happen is we can lose focus on the ones that really matter. Now, we can have things like near critical paths that become the critical paths, much to everyone's surprise. We can have unexpected costs that can burn up all of our contingencies. And finally, risk analysis is a requirement of many companies' gate approval processes. Although that's probably the last reason why you should do risk analysis, because we don't really want to do it just because we have to. Now, in my part of the world, there's a group called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, and they review mega projects in this part of the world. And they've been saying for many years that doing project risk assessment is critical to the success of projects. So why do we then want to take that a step further and conduct combined cost and schedule risk analysis? Well, we want to understand the probability of achieving both our cost and schedule goals. A project isn't successful if it's on time but over budget, and it's not successful if it's on budget but over time. So what we really want to do is we really want to deliver projects which are both on time and on budget. Now, the project team needs to understand where the trade-offs need to be made. So they may have to spend a bit more money to make up schedule, or they may have to give a little on the schedule to keep the costs in control. And they need to be able to make informed decisions. Again, going back to the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, on average, Alberta-based projects experience a 19% cost growth and a 17% schedule growth. So these two items are fairly closely correlated. So risk analysis can help very much in helping our project teams understand what's going on the project. The problem is that the risk analysis can be a bit of a minefield. A bad risk analysis is actually worse than no risk analysis at all. So what are the common failures that people encounter during risk analysis? Well, there's 7 main areas that I've found can lead to bad results. The first one is technical issues in your cost model or your schedule. Political issues around the project that mean that people either won't talk about what's going on or are too busy infighting to actually step back and look clearly at the project. Issues with documentation and risk register. Issues specific to the type of project that you're in that maybe aren't well understood. So if you have a new technology or a fast track project or an iterative development project, those things all have specific challenges that need to be understood. Errors in the risk model itself, so things that are improperly modeled. Lack of integration between cost and schedule risk models, which leads to wildly varying results. And finally, interpretation issues when the model is finally built. So the first thing is, and some of those I won't have time to talk about today, so I'm going to focus on some of the key ones. I won't be able to go through all 7. But the first one is building a schedule suitable for risk analysis. And the same thing goes for costs, a cost model as well. But let's talk about schedule. Is the schedule poor mechanically? Does it have bad logic? Does it have open ends? Does it have high-level information that's much too high level to be able to assign any risks to? Does it have large numbers of constraints or lags? I had a client call me just last week. They have a 3-year project. they did the risk analysis on the schedule, and they came up with a difference between the deterministic finish date and the P80 date of 3 weeks. So he said, well, that doesn't look right. How could over 3 years the difference only be 3 weeks? So we looked at it together, and very quickly what we found was in this schedule of 1,500 activities, there were 500 constraints. There were also about 250 start-finish relationships, which is the most I have ever seen in any schedule in my career. So we could pretty much decide right off the bat that we had some issues around the schedule. The other thing you can happen is sometimes schedules don't reflect reality. For a few years, I worked on projects where I would have to go and evaluate people's schedules. And it's amazing how different the schedule on the computer can be from what's going on out in the field. The other thing is that sometimes people develop these super aggressive schedules because they have to. They won't get the work if their schedule doesn't show them meeting the milestones that are in the contract. So they'll build it to show whatever you want it to show. However, that may not be an achievable goal. And the other thing that's very useful is to get benchmarking done, right? If you're building something and someone else built one 2 years ago down the road, it's kind of useful to know what happened with them before you start working, building up your own schedule. And Mac talked about this a little earlier, too much detail or not enough detail. If you ever want to get, a lot of discussion going in a risk analysis symposium, just start discussing how many activities there should be in a schedule. I'm not going to wade into that today, but I will say that you need enough detail that you can properly model your risks. The other thing that comes up surprisingly often is there's variance between deterministic models in different systems. Now, I'm going to talk about P6 and Primavera risk analysis here because they both come from the same company. And yet when you import the P6 model into PRA, inevitably the deterministic values come up differently. Your end date might shift by months. And so you're starting with a model that doesn't reflect what's in P6. It gets even more complicated if you're going from P6 to Safran or Microsoft Project to Safran, because now they're not even in the same company. So you've got to make sure that you have alignment before you start. The other thing is you can get all kinds of tools like to do QA checks for you, like the DCMA checker. Those things are very useful to make sure that you do in fact have a solid schedule. As one of my mentors used to say, a schedule is garbage in, garbage out, but a risk analysis is garbage in, toxic waste out. So let's talk about political issues that can come up. So sometimes the project team may hide issues that are politically sensitive. If there's a claim going on, if people are just not getting along, oftentimes they won't talk unemotionally and clearly about what the risks are to the project. Sometimes they just don't want the results because they know that the results could well kill the project because there's something going horribly wrong and they don't want to talk about it. The other thing that can happen quite often is that people come up with mitigation strategies that are not realistic or attainable. So one of the things project teams want to do is they want to see that they're likely to be a success. You don't become a project manager if you're not an optimist. So what'll happen is when the risk model shows they're, say, 20% likely to finish on time, the first thing they want to do is they want to start knocking away the items on the tornado chart to get that number up to a higher level. So all those mitigation strategies need to be properly modeled and they need to be attainable. External influences are often not well mapped. So when I'm talking about external influences, I'm talking about if the government changes, do you suddenly lose funding? Can you no longer get permits? You might have project influencers who live in the area of your project, what we call the not in my backyard or NIMBYs, who don't want the project to go ahead, and we need to manage all of that. Once you've actually started to work with the group and you've got a clear picture of what's going on, the next thing we need to look at is interview issues and risk register issues. So again, I talked about agendas versus information previously with political battles going on and people not giving you proper information. One of the ways to get around that is to do one-on-one interviews. And generally speaking, when you go to see a project team, the project manager is just going to want to get everyone around the table and everyone can talk about the risks all together. Well, what always happens is the project manager speaks and nobody else says a word. And so you potentially miss out on some very key information because the project manager either isn't aware of it or is trying to suppress it. The other thing that happens is when people give you information, if they don't really know what the impact is going to be, people tend to underestimate what those impacts are going to end up uh, um, uh, impacting the project. So what'll happen is they'll say, oh, that impact could be as much as 3 months, when in fact it might be as much as 6 months. And it's been consistently shown that when people aren't sure, they tend to underestimate rather than overestimate. One more thing, when we're working with the team and we're building our risk register, we're doing our interviews, we need to talk about opportunities as well as talk about risks. So we call it risk analysis, but maybe we should be calling it opportunity analysis, because in addition to minimizing our risks, we really want to maximize our opportunities. One more thing that I see quite regularly is what I will call review bias or reviewer bias. So I'm a mechanical engineer. I love pumps and motors and anything that moves. I'm not so interested in civil engineering or civil works. But as a reviewer, it's my job to pull information from everybody, not just the people that I'm interested in or the parts of the project I'm interested in. My job is to be a facilitator and not to put my own personal biases onto that project team. A few years ago, I went with a couple of other guys in to do a risk analysis on a fairly large project. We flew in the night before. We drove out to the job site. We sat down in the trailer for the meeting. And the first thing one of the guys said to us is, oh, look, the seagulls are here. So we kind of looked around and said, seagulls? And he said, yeah, you guys, seagulls. You fly in, you crap all over everything, and you fly out again. So, you know, that's not a good start when that's what the project team is expecting. We need to be a facilitator to help them get that information and make it useful to them. Now, there might be an existing risk register on the project. Quite often what happens is, you talk to somebody in contracting and they say, oh yeah, we got a risk register, here you go. And they give you this giant book or giant spreadsheet full of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with project risk. It's about corporate risk and it's about reputation risk and it's about all these other things. And there's very little in there that you can use to build a risk model as to whether this project is going to be completed on time and on budget. Finally, when you do have all the risks put together and you've collated it all and you've put it all together, now you need to actually build it into the cost estimate or into the schedule. So all those project risks that you've identified now have to be mapped. And again, nobody knows that better than the project team. Somebody who's come in cold to the project isn't going to be able to do a very good job of that. So you need to get the project team involved in figuring out where those impacts are likely to occur. So building the risk model. So we've done all this work, we've got all this stuff and we're ready to start building the model. What can go wrong? Well, the one I see the most is people double, triple, quadruple dipping their risks. So they go in a tool like Safran, they put in a risk, they put it in as an absolute risk, maybe with a 20-day impact, and then they assign it to 20 activities in a row. Well, when that risk fires, now you've got 400 days added to your schedule because 20 activities each got a 20-day impact. So you have to be very careful that you step through the analysis and understand that the impacts are what you expect them to be. The other thing is we have this thing where we've got risk events and we've got uncertainties, and we need to understand each risk that we've identified. Is it an uncertainty or is it a risk event? And make sure that it's appropriately defined and appropriately applied. Glenn talked in the last session about being able to put uncertainty right on the activities through the risk module. I've been telling people for the last few years to stop putting uncertainties on the activities and just use the risk module. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. Okay, the other thing is we can waste a lot of time talking about low probability, high impact events. So we need to understand what those are, and we need to understand where they're going to hit us if they come up, but we shouldn't waste a lot of time on them. And I'll give you a great example. If you told me in 2018 that all these projects across the world would have been slammed by a pandemic, which would have stopped everyone from working for months on end, I probably would have laughed at you. That's a black swan event. It's completely beyond the control of the project team. It's a huge impact on the projects themselves, and really the project team can't be held responsible for it. So let's not waste a lot of time worrying about those. And I have had situations where the management team identifies something like this and they want to analyze it to the nth degree, but it's so unlikely to happen, and it's so beyond their control, you shouldn't waste any time on it. The other thing is, when you're building the model, keep it simple. Don't get too complicated. Don't get in big discussions about distribution shapes. People go on and on and on about, should I use a triangular distribution or should I use a beta PERT distribution? Fernando did a white paper that's up on the Safran site where he talks about the differences are pretty small when it actually comes down to it, and are certainly the differences in the distribution shape areas are less than the uncertainty that you have in the original estimate of impact. So don't get overly worried about it. Also, don't get too worried if there's some activities that don't have uncertainties on them. You don't have to go into a cleanup exercise, or some minor activity with 2 years of float on it has uncertainty associated with it. Finally, when you're dealing with a cost model, don't try and make the cost model too complicated. People build economic factors, corporate risks, they build these enormous spreadsheets. It's not usually necessary when we're talking about, is this project going to finish on time and on budget? Finally, when you're building the risk model, document everything that you do, because if you have to come back in 3 months and relook at that model, you probably won't remember anything that you did, and you'll pretty much have to start from scratch. So even if you've got a deadline you're working to, and you're working all weekend and you're doing all kinds of scenarios, make sure you document them. That step will save you, or me, if I have to come in 6 months and pick up the model, a lot of work. Finally, don't bang your head against the wall. Don't try and do schedule risk in a spreadsheet. Don't try and do cost risk using a resource loaded schedule. Okay, both of those are just a whole lot of work. You can do it. People have proven that you can do it, but it's a lot of work and it's just not worth the effort. So talking about cost and schedule risk, historically they've been done separately. They're not generally combined. I worked on many projects over the years where cost and schedule were never even spoken about in the same room, or they get combined too late in the process, but they're completely related and we need to model them together. So Safran has this great ability to do a schedule risk analysis and a cost risk analysis in 2 separate modules, but link them as required. So going back to the COAA comment, Alberta-based projects experience a 19% cost growth and a 17% schedule growth. We want to understand how those are related, but there's times when they're not. So the way that Safran's done it with those 2 modules makes it very easy to build an integrated cost and schedule model. And I'm really looking forward to the release 2.0 of the cost module. So finally, interpreting the results. So you've built this model, you step through, everything looks good. Now you want to run it, you want to do the full thing. So you take a look at the model. The first thing is the results shouldn't be a huge surprise to you, okay? It's quite possible that the tornado is going to have things moved around from what you expect. It's possible that the tails are going to be a bit longer or shorter than you expect, but you should pretty much have a pretty good idea of what's going to show up and where it's going to show up. And if something is a big surprise, so, something's at the top of the tornado you didn't expect, go back and spend the time and understand why. The next thing is, does it pass the sniff test, right? So my client who phoned me up last week said, I got a 3-year project with 3 weeks between the deterministic date and the P80 date. That doesn't pass the sniff test. Sure enough, there was all kinds of mechanical issues with the schedule. Should he have maybe checked the schedule first? Maybe, but at least he caught it here before he gave it to management. Okay, the other thing that can happen is we present results in what I'll call technobabble, right? So we go and we put the tornado chart up and we tell the project team that there's an 80% correlation between this risk and the end of the project. And the project team looks at it and says, okay, but the next one's 75 and then 60. What does that mean? Well, you're getting into discussion about Pearson's product moment, and pretty soon you're way off the 80-20 curve again. So what you need to do is make the results understandable to the project team. Okay, and Safran's got some great tools that will do analysis by exclusion, where you can say to the project team, if you can get rid of this risk, you will save 35 days, or you will save $500,000, or whatever it is. There are tools in Safran to let you do that. Don't give them the tornado chart with a bunch of percentages on it, because they won't understand it. All right, the other thing is the project team, we're talking about making it understandable for them, and a great way to do that is to talk about joint confidence level. If I go in and say, okay, I'm 20% likely to achieve my schedule, and I'm 35% likely to achieve my cost based on the deterministic values, that's not very helpful to the project team. So then I say, okay, well, for P70, I need this much contingency on time, I need this much contingency on cost. Again, what the project team wants is they want both cost and schedule to meet the target, so they can say the project was a success. Now, the nice thing about the joint confidence level is it doesn't give us a single point result. It doesn't say, okay, our finish date is going to be X and our finish cost is going to be Y. It says there's a range of values that will all meet that P70 requirement. Okay, and then the project team can decide where they need to be on that curve. So I've just drawn, I've taken a snapshot here from Safran, and I've just highlighted the P70 curve on here, kind of crudely. But you can see anywhere along that curve represents a successful or a P70 joint confidence level. Now my costs are on the left-hand side on the vertical axis, and my dates are on the horizontal axis. But what this is telling me, if I look in the upper left corner there, you can see the bar that I've drawn starts to go vertical. And that means it doesn't matter at that point how much money I spend, I'm not going to save any more time on my schedule. Similarly, if I look down and to the right where it goes horizontal, I can see it doesn't matter how much time I give, I'm not going to save any cost. But in between those, in the area where there's actually a curve, the project team can decide where they need to be. So this is really useful information to give a project team. They can trade off a little bit of money, spend a bit more money and accelerate the schedule, or they can choose to conserve the money and give back some time. So again, it helps the project team really understand what's going on. So in summary, risk analysis is a great tool, but the process is just as important as the software. Remember, garbage in, garbage out in a schedule becomes garbage in, toxic waste out when you're dealing with risk analysis. It needs to be properly executed. It shouldn't just be a checkbox on a form. You're going to put a lot of effort into it. It should be something that helps the project team do a better job managing the project. Make the results usable to the project team. So we want to make it better for the project team. We want them to make informed decisions. Put it in formats that they understand. Talk about days and dollars that you could potentially save. Run some analyses and do comparisons. As Fernando showed earlier, you can say, okay, well, you know, this mitigation strategy is better than this other mitigation strategy because even though I spend a bit more money, I'm going to save a lot of time. Don't try and conduct cost and schedule risk analysis separately. The tools have got to the point where you can now do them in one place. And finally, don't be a seagull.